Latin America, because emerging markets have been so much in focus.
And especially for us this week, Kathleen, post-Jackson Hole, because that was definitely one of the themes of the Jackson Hole Kansas City Fed Symposium this year, an international flavor, and Latin American equities selling off, Latin American currencies selling off. Well, with us right now we have Cate Ambrose. She's President and Executive Director of the Latin American Private Equity and Venture Capital Association. That's LAVCA. That sounds like a bit of a mouthful. Cate, perhaps in your own words you'd explain to us what exactly that is.
Yeah, LAVCA is a nonprofit trade association. So we represent over 150 investment firms active in Latin America. That ranges all the way from global asset managers like KKR, Carlyle, Blackstone, Providence, etc., all the way down to small venture funds on the ground from Mexico to Argentina.
So tell us about your background. How did you get to this position?
Oh gosh, that's a long story. Let's see if I go with a brief version. I really come to it through the prism of economic development. I lived in Spain for many, many years. I started my career as a journalist myself. I worked for many years at The Economist and happened to develop a niche involved with a meeting annually with private equity investors active in Latin America. I was at the United Nations for a couple of years.
Wow.
And joined LAVCA in 2007. And frankly, it was such an exciting opportunity at that time because there hadn't been much happening prior to 2007, and that was the beginning of a very important cycle of investment.
I get a little bit, I don't know what you would call it about this, but Africa's making a turn, it seems, from who are we going to get aid? They still need aid, but who's going to invest in where? And it seems like Latin America has made this switch as well, which is so important. If you studied economic development, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, it was all about building big projects and getting money in. But it seems to me it's a much more powerful development when investors are saying, here's a place to go in and invest money, because this means real growth for these countries.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the first thing I need to do to set up this conversation is say I'm talking about specific countries, which are Mexico, Brazil, Peru, Colombia, and Chile. I mean, there is a little bit of a divide in terms of where different economies in the region are in terms of their policies. But in those countries, I cannot tell you how proactive governments are about bringing in private investors. Colombia, just to single that country out, I have literally heard stories and seen firsthand the president's office calling international private equity firms, encouraging them to come and invest in the country.
Now, that's not the same as hot money, right?
No, exactly. And that is the critical issue. Governments in these countries understand that private equity is long-term development capital, technology transfer, professionalization of mid-sized family-owned businesses, and of course on the venture side, entrepreneurship, innovation, etc. So there is very strong public support for that platform.
So we had the privilege of interviewing Agustin Carstens, the governor of the Central Bank of Mexico, the Ben Bernanke of Mexico. You could say he seemed pretty sanguine on the economic growth possibilities, reforms that they're doing in terms of budget, not getting in the way, keeping inflation under control. On the other hand, at the Jackson Hole conference itself, out in the Kansas City Fed Economic Symposium, he kind of seemed to be telling the developed nations, go a little bit, be careful as you get ready to taper and take those steps, as others have. Are you seeing the impact on private equity, or does that just not matter to private equity if these big, if you have the big up in emerging markets and then the big down?
Right. I mean, I think there's just no getting away from the fact that there is enormous concern across emerging markets, including, the major economies in Latin America, about what the shift in Fed policy, what that impact is going to have. If nothing else, it affects capital markets, and of course, the liquidity of the Bovespa in Brazil, will affect the opportunity to IPO a company on the way out, that type of thing. But I think, actually, LAVCA collects proprietary data on fundraising, exits, and investments in Latin America. We just finished our first half-year data, and actually all of those indicators were up. There was more money invested. There was more international money committed to private equity funds in the region, and there were actually more IPOs and exits as well. I think, again, it's a long-term investment horizon, and it's really about today those fundamentals, being in place, because that's what institutional investors going into those markets are betting on. They're not betting on where the market's going to be tomorrow. They're betting on a long-term growth opportunity.
Still, if you're an investor that went into Brazil, you're not all that happy at the moment with the weakness in the real?
So there has been a shift away from Brazil, over the course of the last couple of years. And when the Latin America story started really taking off about 5 years ago, it was Brazil and the B in BRIC. So it was all about Brazil as one of the, large global economies. And that has really shifted towards Peru, Colombia, Chile, and Mexico over the last few years. And definitely investor sentiment towards Brazil is, not as strong. On the other hand, private equity investors are not betting on GDP growth. In many cases, they're investing in local currencies, so they're not, don't have that kind of exposure. And of course, on the valuation side, they're benefiting from the fact that a very hot market, which they were facing 2-3 years ago, is much more challenging environment for private equity investors to be doing deals.
Can you give us a sense of what kind of deals, what kinds of companies, what kinds of industries private equity tends to be favoring right now or shunning?
Yeah, that's a great question. Big part of the story has been the consumer story. So while it's not unusual for people to think about Latin America as a source of natural resources and commodities, and there's no question that that is a piece of it, it's actually been the domestic consumption story in Brazil and Mexico. So healthcare, financial services, education has been absolutely huge. In fact, there's recently a merger with a deal done by 2 different private equity firms to create the largest public education company in the world, I've been told, between Croton Educational and Anhanguera in Brazil. So and then retailing has been huge. We've seen multiple deals of eyewear retail chains, the Home Depot out of Peru, pharmaceutical chains, everything that was like clothing, so everything related to retail, and restaurant chains. There's been a whole spate of very significantly sized deals on the restaurant side.
One of the things we spoke with Carstens about was energy reform in Mexico, huge reform. It may even, take hold across some other Latin American nations. How does that change the investment climate, and how do investors take advantage of some liberalization of the energy markets?
Yeah, well, this is going to be an incredibly important reform for Mexico for many reasons. Mexico is well behind other countries in Latin America, and actually globally one of the most restrictive. I think it's been compared to Iran and I don't know where else in terms of, the limitations. There just is no private investment in that sector. So this is going to be very significant for Mexico. Brazil had already, had a much more liberalized energy sector, although it's still dominated by Petrobras. But there's no question that this reform in Mexico is going to create great opportunities, not only for energy investors, but also knock-on effects for so many different sectors, because the cost of energy is so high. The role of Pemex in that economy has created enormous inefficiency, and so it really is a much bigger bellwether for what's going to happen in that economy.
Telecoms, does this bode well for deregulation there as well, and more investment opportunities in Mexico?
It's so exciting to see this administration in Mexico and the pact that they form with the other parties finally standing up to that monopoly. Carlos Slim got a hold of Telmex, through a privatization, over a decade ago, and it's it's one of the most expensive telecoms markets in the world. And there have been incremental efforts to sort of, rein him in, and I think now is the first time that we're seeing meaningful reform, and again, a pact of the 3 different parties in Mexico, which is what we've never had before, that will bring meaningful change in telecoms as well.
Is there more of a concentration on Mexico now that it's doing better than other Latin American countries? Are some of them being shunned?
So we've definitely seen this shift, sort of the herd mentality moving from Brazil towards Mexico, no question about it. But the other thing I'd have to say in all fairness is today Mexico is a very underdeveloped private equity market for the size of the economy. Brazil is by far the most developed because they've had the local pension funds in Brazil have been investing for over 10 years. You've got a much bigger pool of managers, and you have Brazilian asset managers that have raised billion-dollar funds, $2 billion funds. In Mexico, it's really only a handful of local private equity funds that have been active there. So we see many more global investors asking for information on Mexico, making trips to Mexico, but it's still an incipient market and the beginning of a new cycle going forward.
Just have to ask you told us before we sat down to talk that you come from a family of tennis players. You don't play, but your daughter's a competitive tennis player, and she's here with you today at the U.S. Open.
Yes, that's right. She's she's really delighted to be there. In fact, she was going to come to the interview, and I don't know who it was, but she saw somebody on the court over there and said, I'm in love with him. I must run over there and see him play tennis. So.
What's her name?
Sophia.
Sophia Ambrose.
And Pasquale, actually.
Pasquale. And she's a competitive player.
Yes, she's on the tennis team at Beacon High School, which I think was they won. They're at the top of the rankings in the New York City tennis competition.
Well, you certainly rise to the rankings of the Advantage Hayes. Cate Ambrose, thank you so much for joining us. We hope you'll come back.
I'll be delighted to be back. Thanks so much for having me today.
President of LAVCA, the Latin American Private Equity and Venture Capital Association. This is Advantage Hayes. Betty Lou in the loop at the half, 12 to 12:30. We're back at 12:30 with Pete Bodo from tennis.com.